Kyle, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here.
Just want to start with your background. You can talk for as long as you want about, where you came from, what church, what organization, and we'll go from there.
Sure. So I was born into the LDS, aka Mormon religion, as were you, it sounds like. And I guess my deconstruction story, the, a lot of people leave because of a lot of like the mental things not making sense. They research it, and then there's a lot of things that just don't add up. And as more and more of these things that don't add up accumulate on the shelf, and that stuff grows, and eventually it snaps the shelf. That's how a lot of people leave whatever religion they've come from. And for me, it was actually a little bit different. True to what was expected of me, I never looked at any, anti-Mormon literature, which is just called literature. We can, get rid
Yeah.
of the anti-Mormon part because, anyway, that's its own topic. But I left because I started feeling like I was becoming less of a person by staying in this faith, which is very counterintuitive, right? Because having grown up in this faith that it's the one and only true church, it's the best that anyone has to offer. And at about the time I started deconstructing, and it's hard to know exactly when you start deconstructing, right? Because I mean, there's like if I was to be honest about like the first time I had a deconstruction thought, I was probably 5 years old. And I guess I was 5 years old because I was still young enough to lay down on the pew and have it be socially acceptable. But I
Right.
remember looking up, and you've been in LDS um, church buildings before, and they have like the speakers that go all the way along the ceiling, like kind of cuts the room in half. And I was looking
Yep.
up at these speakers, just or looking up at the actual speakers, not the person speaking. And I was listening to someone talk about, God and religion and just all the stuff that I was like, this is where we go on Sundays to talk about Jesus and stuff. And I remember having this thought that was just so unexplainable to me in my 5 or so year mind. And I was able to conceptualize that within this little sphere, there is God and religion and Mormonism and all the things we talk about at church. And for the first time in my life, I asked myself this question, which was, what's outside of that? And I had never
Wow.
conceptualized that before. And like for like a 5 year old kid, that's a very deep thought because I basically took everything that I knew and said, okay, we're going to compartmentalize that. What's outside of it? And I remember that was the most, like to this day, that was the most profound sense of awe that I had ever experienced. Like, and I had no words to describe this. So it was just kind of like the first time I had imagined beyond God and religion, which is the name of my company now. So it kind of comes from that experience.
Wow.
And anyway, so that was probably the first deconstruction thing where I just imagined that there was something outside of all of this, or that there could be at least. Now, obviously, being a kid and having no autonomy or sense of self, I just kind of did what was expected of me. But fast forward to like, college age, um, I remember just, I'd be in church, and there was one particular lesson, and it was about people of color not being able to have the priesthood, in particularly Africans. And the bishop's wife was teaching it, and I remember her lesson just seemed so insulting to me, like I was
Hmm.
being infantilized, that I was being treated
Yep.
like I was stupid. And so her lesson was basically, okay, so some prophets were super racist, and then she immediately, after making that point, the rest of the lesson, like never to return to that point of what those mistakes were or anything, was just, but we had these prophets that brought up, like, racism and stuff, but like, it's so awesome though, because like prophets are amazing and they, set it all straight. And so I was like, so prophets cause the problem, but they're also the savior. It's like me starting someone's house on fire, and is like the last, beam falls into ash. I come and throw a bucket of water on it, and I'm like, hero, like, look at
Yeah.
me. It's just, it didn't make sense that you could be both the hero and the villain in that sense. Obviously, on another sense, we're all heroes and villains in other people's stories. But I didn't imagine like this claim that the church makes that they are the one and only true church speaking for God, would have to redact something that God had told them, because that raises the question of, did God actually tell them this thing? Like,
Yeah.
because of all the things that God should not need, editors. You shouldn't.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole, you're perfect and all things are before you. You have, all wisdom. There's not anything that can come this God's way without him knowing about it in advance, and then being all powerful, him being able to alter anything so that if something awful was going to happen, he would know about it beforehand and have the ability to change that thing and keep it from happening. And that also that he loves us, perfectly. I was like, these things cannot coexist together. Anyway,
Yeah.
so in regards to like leaving, people, there's heart reasons and then there's head reasons, and most of us leave because of a combination of the two. But because I had done such a good job of just completely repressing and not ever entertaining or engaging with or reading, anti-Mormon literature, the only way that I left myself to get out, looking back now in hindsight, was like reasons pertaining to the heart and like the suffering that the church caused, and its treatment of LGBTQ people. And it had never really sat right with me, but I was just like, like, take it up with the big man. I'm just, this puny person, which is another thing that religion instilled in me, that I am like left to my own devices, I would take my life off a cliff. And so I need the church. And so it also indoctrinated these ideas into me that I am nobody. And that again, it's the infantilization, that I'm stupid. And, the church, says that you're not allowed to watch R-rated movies, which makes perfect sense for, a cult to say that, because R-rated movies have R-rated themes, and a lot of those go into abuse and coercion and narcissism and things that you just don't get out of a Disney movie, that you don't have it, laid out for you and is honest and thoroughly as it would be in like an R-rated movie. Anyway, so I had just graduated BYU, and I was just like, get me out of Provo. And I had an aunt who was in Sacramento, California, and she had a really thriving real estate business. And she's like, dude, come out here and, train under me, and I'll get you off the ground and we'll get started and all that. So I went out there, and all I really heard at the time was, I don't have to be in Utah anymore. And I feel like so many Mormons kind of quietly feel that, of just like, oh my gosh, like there's so much, just exhausting to exist in Utah when you're in this high demand religion, because it infiltrates every facet of your life. I mean, down to your underwear, this religion controls you. And I think that we subconsciously pick up on that, but consciously we've been trained to be like, nope, get rid of that thought. Anyway, so I go out to California. I bought a car and then drove there the next day. And as I got out there, we're getting into my what, like the pivotal thing that kind of lit the fuse to my deconstruction, which was this girl that I dated. And she was just one of the coolest people that I had ever met. Like, I was so blown away by the quality of this girl, and she was amazing. And anyway, we realized at the beginning of the summer that I had just come from BYU to California, and at the end of the summer, she was going to BYU. And so it was like, missed each other, And
Yeah.
so she had mentioned that, because we kind of just vibed right off the bat, and it seemed like, I was just super impressed with her. And so we kind of had this talk of like, yeah, so I'm leaving at the end of the summer, what she said. And so like, probably shouldn't date, because it's kind of like, raising an animal just to slaughter it. It's like unnecessary pain. And I was like, well, yeah, that's one way to look at it. And I tried to convince her that, like, it's better to have loved and lost than to have never loved at all. And that argument won her over. So we started dating, and it was just the coolest relationship that I had ever been in. It was so, so solid. Anyway, end of the
Yeah.
summer comes, we break up because I didn't want to, like, keep her from, she was going to Mormon Mecca for dating. I didn't want to like be this dude in California who's like, you better not be looking at any. It seemed silly to be that person. So we broke up, but then over time, she would just like be in the Nickelcade parking lot and just be talking to me while her friends were inside playing for like 2 hours. And so like we just kind of kept the relationship up. And I was like, I guess kind of by default, we're doing the distance thing. Anyway, things in California after like a few months had not really panned out. I realized that like being a realtor in California and, moving to a place where I knew no one, to engage in a very, relationship network heavy kind of a job where you need to know people, and I knew nobody. It was really hard to
Yeah.
get off the ground, and I was like, let's not. And also, this girl had moved back, to Provo, which was where I had, my last like 6 years had been there, so all of my connections and everything was there. So I pick
Yeah.
up the phone to call her to tell her like, hey, we can date, And as I pick up my phone, I see that she's calling me. And I answer the phone,
Wow.
like so excited to tell her this news. And she's like, okay, hold on. Before you say anything, I just need to let you know I went to the temple and I prayed about you, and God said no. just like, just
Okay.
like, like just womp, obviously the worst thing in the world. In that moment, was the beginning of what lit the fuse to me no longer believing. And the reason why is because I could not understand in any capacity of my human brain that people abuse children. God does nothing, just lets it happen. And like so and so wants to date so and so, and then God jumps out of the bushes and blows the whistle. Like that's where he decides to materialize and to intervene. Did not make sense to me. Now that was one of the things that went up on the shelf because as I was going through all of this pain of realizing that like I was losing this person, I didn't understand why. It was the best relationship I ever had. That was like the worst. But like
Yep.
that opened me up to like being more critical thinking about all this stuff,
Okay.
about like the ideas don't make sense. And so initially, while I had kind of um, distanced myself, I guess mentally from the church, even though I was still, and I guess I was PMO at that point, physically and
Uh,
mentally out.
yep.
It was when I started asking questions because I was in so much pain that I had to understand. See, as a member of the church, my usual, technique to deal with things that made me feel uncomfortable or that I didn't understand or that I just hoped weren't true was I would just wave my magic wand of faith and be like, be gone, I'll just faith it, because
Yeah.
faith is not reason. You do not have to critically think or, I guess, intellectually maneuver yourself to the conclusion that you have come to. You faith your way there. And like the realm of faith is so attractive to the human mind because you don't have to fact check a damn thing. It's like the one place where if it feels good, it is good, you know? Whereas like, you look, like if somebody was to say like, yeah, like McDonald's tastes so good, I'm just going to eat this, for forever. Immediately, even the religious people are just like, no, that doesn't make sense. But they'll commit that same logical fallacy within the realm of faith because faith bypasses logic, reason, and critical thinking. And that's like, just what I was used to. But then eventually, that dissonance starts to build and all the things, the feelings, the suffering, and then you hear things like Brigham Young signing an extermination order against the native Timpanogos here in Utah and wiping out about 70,000 Native Americans, and it's like, what? And there's just things that it's like usually, like somebody would say some Brigham Young or Joseph Smith quote that I was like, that's crazy. I could easily just, boom. But then when it came to something of that magnitude, I was like, what? And then I started looking into things. So I had left the church and was already like I had realized that I was an atheist at this point. So basically, the usual coping skills that I had relied on to kind of keep my faith intact were no longer useful. And then as I was, becoming, I was training to become a life coach, and I was exposed to the world of mental health at a depth that I had never, looked into before. And it started. This is another places, one of the other places where that my dissonance grew. And it was because I had this online course that I was taking, and it was just blowing my mind. Like there were so many incredible things that I was learning. And when it came to, like waking up on Sunday to go to 3 hours of church, I didn't see the reason because I was like, I could go like 1 hour of going through my life coaching certification course that I was going through was worth a month of Sundays. Like I got so little out of church. It was mainly just social. But as far as like me nourishing, myself, it seemed more like, I guess this this was when I think the church was barely starting to really panic about the amount of people leaving and the amount of information that was out there. And so going to church felt like panic because,
Yeah.
a lot of, there were all this, usually you just, do your 3 hours of church, but then all of a sudden they would have these new activities and, guest speakers coming to church who were trying to address these topics that apparently, people were leaving over. And it just felt
Yep.
more tense than it usually did, because there wasn't much opposition in the church because you're in an echo chamber and all the voices that you hear are the ones that sound like, everybody else's voices. They're just unanimous about, the church is true and the prophets are real and the Book of Mormon is, the word of God, just, the same things. And as those started to not really work out, and my heart wasn't feeling good about being there, which of course I initially, was like, that's the devil. Got to go to church harder, got to read my scriptures harder, got to do all these things harder. And it still didn't help. And so I naturally started, questioning, well, if like church offers so little over here, and there's all these other things over here that offer so much, it's kind of weird that something like a life coaching course, for example, that, is the product of man would be so much more beautiful and useful and effective at getting me to change and become a better person than what God came up with. Because that does not match the brochure, of religion, that man can do something better than God. It's always God's ways are higher than yours. You're an idiot. He's up here, you're down here, and it just didn't make sense anymore. So I fought all of this as long as I could, and then I think this was like February of 2019. I'm on a ski trip with two of my buddies in Banff, Canada, and this was the first time in my life where I had, I guess, my shelf collapsed is what happened. It was like 3 a.m. 3 a.m. and I wake up and my brain is racing like it has never been racing before. It is like I'm like awake but still completely dreaming. And I think as I try to like piece together like why it happened then and what the circumstances were for this. I mean, first of all, I was asleep, and what's running your show when you're asleep? Your subconscious mind, not your conscious mind. And my subconscious mind had already pieced together so much stuff, but it couldn't get up into it. It couldn't break the surface of the water and get into my conscious mind. And so I was sleeping, and I was having this like almost like a vision.
Yep.
I was in a courtroom and there was an argument for and against God and for and against Mormonism and just the whole, God and religion bubble. And it was the first time in my life that the voice representing the opposition to those things was my voice. It was me that was saying like, no. And I was basically arguing for atheism because the conclusion that I had come to that like from which I have never, recovered was that you can out logic religion, but even more importantly than that, you can out ethics religion with ease. And I thought, and that's basically when you realize you're an atheist, when that kind of when you can beat God basically morally and logically.
Yeah.
And that was kind of the beginning of me, researching evolution, something I did not know. My first TikTok that really took off was me just saying, I cannot believe that I did not, understand evolution, because I just took that, well, we're from God, and that was good enough for me. I didn't see any reason to go beyond that because I was so certain that my religion was true and that these men who were, dictating my life, like down to my underwear, were right. And again, I didn't have to critically think my way to that position. I faithed my way there, which is quite easy,
Yep.
So that's kind of a bit of my deconstruction story. And I guess at the end of like, I left because of my heart. And then the more I actually like deconstructed and got into like the brain side of the arguments and stuff and was able to beat it there, the heart and the mind both left and have become so much happier, so much healthier. And I was like, okay, like you want to make the by their fruits you shall know them claim? Like, cool, I support that. Like, because I have never been happier, never been healthier, never been more ethical. Not that there's not room for improvement, but way better of a human being, I think, just objectively than I ever was as a religious person. So that's kind of a little bit of an overview of my deconstruction story. And I was certified as a life coach, and then I shifted into the deconstruction sphere that I'm in now, because that's
Okay.
where most of my learning and my development and kind of grappling with a lot of the issues that have kind of made me who I am. And so that's where I'm most useful. And if there's anything I want to be, it's useful. So this is
Wow,
where I
that's
am,
really
and I
great.
love doing it. So ever since I started doing this, I haven't worked a day in my life. It's been so fun, so fulfilling. And I just get to have cool conversations with people and, coach people through some of the hardest things that they've ever been through, and to see them really able to make changes and to be able to heal. And they're not just, this walking coping mechanism for the rest of their lives. So
Yeah.
deconstruction is risky because it is so traumatic, it is so painful. Because having your entire worldview just evaporate before your eyes, it's like religion wasn't something that you did; it was something that you were. It was your entire identity. Again, down to your underwear. Religion dictated your life, and so to have that
Yeah.
all go away, while it's extremely freeing, it's also completely terrifying. It's like, because when you're reading the script of religion and just doing what they say you need to do, at least you have some sense of certainty and direction. And then all that goes away, and it's just like you don't know who you are. You are just, it's so hard to be able to navigate this existence without those things, which is one of the reasons, again, why religion has been so prevalent throughout our histories, because it gives us a narrative that, because we don't have to fact check it, we can feel certain about. And so without that, it's like, whoo, good luck. And it's a lot for people. So it's kind of like surgery. It's like nobody wants to go, but it's best that you do.
Yeah. Yeah. When, like you mentioned, like your whole identity and the foundation that you built your life on is taken out from underneath you, it really does throw people into, or it can throw a lot of people, into that, like, who am I? What's the purpose of life? They just, it's really hard. That's what I experienced when I went
Yeah.
through it. So yeah, I did have a couple other follow-up questions. Just so with the timeline, how long ago from now was your deconstruction kind of like where you had that trip to Banff, and then I guess like when did you leave the church in
Yeah.
this
So my
timeline?
my heart, and I think this is pretty typical for most people, your heart leaves before your feet do. Because
Yeah.
we've been trained to fight as hard as you can for your faith, even if you realize yourself that your arguments are awful. So 2018, I remember the summer of 2018, I was working for this startup company, and I decided to like stop wearing my top garment. So I was just wearing the bottoms because they were just functional underwear. So I was like, why not? But I was also like, it's summer and this is a desert and it's Utah. So, like looking back now, like I'm almost just like, oh man, like it's such a slow, painful, way out, trying to stretch my faith as far as it would go, and it's still not being enough for me to, reconcile everything that I had felt and, later what I had learned. Um, so yeah, it was about 2018 was when my feet actually left, and I started, being vocal and talking to my family, because I had realized that if I'd been on this kick learning about authenticity and like what that life is like, which is something that I had never really experienced. I always assumed I was being authentic, but it's like when you look back and look at how little consent was ever a part of your life with going on a mission and with going to church, it was just like you do
Yep.
it, and if you don't, I mean, there's implicit punishments and then there's explicit punishments.
Hmm.
It's like implicitly, you might know that you're going to be a disappointment to your family and that you're going to make them sad or maybe even angry. And then explicitly, there's a lot of people who talk about how if you don't serve a mission, like, we're not going to date you because you're less than. Like, why would I date a non-return missionary when I can date a return missionary? Fast forward to like now, I have cousins coming home from their missions, and they're out in a matter of months. Like, just, it's like they even on their missions, they're just like, oh my gosh, we're so done with this. But you can't admit that. Then you come home and then they leave really quickly, which is great for them. That, like, because it took me till I was 28, to put it together. And a lot of that was due to the fact that I was so stalwart in never looking at anything that might shake my faith, which was, turns out I thought that was a virtue. That was a vice. And it kept
Yeah.
me from a lot of experiences that could have been so much more beautiful and so much more
Mm.
authentic. But yeah, authenticity was one of the big things, because I started realizing that, like, I don't fit in here. And I think, like, on some level that I always realized that there's a lot of things about me that just aren't here. And this is actually one of the things that I go through with a lot of my coaching clients. It's called shadow work. It's part of Jungian psychology. It comes from a Swiss psychiatrist, Carl Jung. Have you looked into shadow work before?
I've heard you and Kara on her channel
Oh
go
yeah,
into it with,
yeah,
so I've watched that, and yeah, yeah, really
yeah. It
enjoyed that. So yeah, go into that for people that aren't super familiar.
Sure, yeah. So one of the places where I have developed expertise and try to use that as much as possible in my relationships with people who are deconstructing clients is it has to do with identity crisis, because we always talk about this faith crisis, but faith crisis almost always brings with it an identity crisis as well, because again, religion wasn't something that you did; it was something that you are, that you were. So Jungian psychology and this concept of the shadow basically comes from, as we like grow and develop, there's a part of our brain that is active, that like has formed, like even like before we're 1 year old, which means that in order to get love, we start realizing that in order to get what we want, we have to change our behavior. Like they've been able to document this in babies. And the reason why this is important is because it challenges the question of people saying, like, now, if I can just remember who I was, as a kid, that was my authentic self, that I've changed this way. But the truth is, even that version of yourself, of you as like 5 years old, you had already begun kind of disowning parts of yourself or quieting certain, traits that you have in order to get that love. And so there really isn't like, an anchor or a way with it we can kind of compare ourselves, something that we can compare ourselves to, so that we can see, am I being authentic? Because if you're comparing that, to a version of yourself that had already begun shape-shifting, basically, in order to get love, approval, validation, then there's no way for you to prove what is you and what is not. And again, that can be very terrifying. But I help my clients see that as like the coolest thing ever, is that you are absolutely boundless, and
Yeah,
the uncovering of what has been put into your shadow, like there's so much down there. And what's interesting about the shadow that we create is that we almost always create it subconsciously. In other words, we don't realize that we're doing it. And this also exists outside of the religious realm. So for example, let's take a highly creative child who is born into a family that has a very pragmatic, be a doctor or a lawyer sort of a culture, and that creative child is treated as though his creativity is like an obnoxious phase or a distraction that he needs to grow up from, you know. And it's
yeah,
really interesting. And one of the case studies that I found so interesting as I was researching personality and temperament, like what can be changed, what is hardwired, the nature nurture debate. One of the most interesting case studies is Bob Ross. Now, Bob Ross is the painter, right? So he's
yeah.
very feminine, very flowery. So he was a drill sergeant for like almost his entire life.
Wow.
Can you imagine Bob Ross being a drill sergeant? Like just kind of living up
Nope.
to the societal norms of what a man should be. And you can only imagine, this flowery, feminine, beautiful human being that he was, that wasn't able to come out until he'd left the military. And when he left the military, by the way, he vowed he would never raise his voice again, which I thought was kind of an
Wow.
interesting data point, because when people, are like, the sign that something wasn't healthy or that wasn't, authentic, wasn't you, it was that you walk away with a vow saying, I'm not going to do that again, you know?
Yep.
And then he turned into the Bob Ross that we all know and love today. It's like, I have paintings on my wall that I did painting along with Bob Ross, and like they're awesome. It's like I would not have had those experiences had he not been like, okay, like F this, I'm gonna be
Yeah.
me, and that was really cool. So he's an interesting case study because number one, he shows you that you can, just deny yourself for a long period of time and totally make it work. You can get your bills paid, but it's kind of like you climb the ladder only to realize that you're up against the wrong wall. Or it's like getting really good at a job that you hate. It's like, why? that authenticity. Like there's got to be something in you that there's a market for that you love doing. And I find that most people haven't, found that because, we're so busy living up to these expectations. And because we don't really have a good reference for like who I could be, like who is Kyle? Like what is the self? Now, arguably the self doesn't exist. That's, we'll leave that for another time. But basically just when people are deconstructing, they've had all the stability, the certainty, the script taken away from them. And they're just sitting there like, a ship without a rudder. And it's very easy for our brains to go into panic mode, instead of seeing that as like the most beautiful thing that could possibly happen to us. And Carl Jung talks about how like the beginning of a person is after the annihilation of everything they ever thought or believed. A complete factory reset of everything. It is all gone. And so it's like there's this other quote that I heard, and I can't remember who said it, but it's like you have two lives. One of them is the first life is the one that you're born into, and then the second one is when you realize there won't be another.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it totally
That
it
concept.
shifts that, and so all of a sudden life becomes infinitely more precious. At least it has for me as an atheist, because like I don't believe there is a sequel. If there is one, as long as it's not the Judeo-Christian, sequel. So Carl Jung, shadow work, I help people to kind of dive into basically their shadow, to understand what parts of themselves they've unconsciously repressed without realizing it. Because so much of what's in our shadow is beautiful and useful and helps to really round us out. And by exploring the shadow, we find out so much about ourselves that we didn't know was there. And so it's like shadow work is a really good framework. And I do Jungian psychology with shadow work, and then I couple that with the things I've learned about personality and temperament, and kind of help people to explore these frameworks. And I see that a lot of people, when they have an identity crisis, they'll often go to like a personality test. And the problem with
Yep.
personality tests is that a lot of them are very, you're this or that. It's very dualistic.
Mm-hmm.
So, like for example, Carl Jung came up with the big five of personality. And so you can think of it as like five coins, right? You have introvert and then you have extrovert. That's one of the coins. And then you have these other four coins, and together they comprise what a personality is made up of. And with personality tests, people are trying to, like, the test is trying to figure out, are you an introvert or are you an extrovert? Are you creative or are you pragmatic? But the truth is, while we definitely do have, certain proclivities to one side or the other, when we abandon parts of ourselves, or like we take this test and says, well, it says I'm this over here and I'm this and I'm that one and I'm that one and I'm that one, then what we're also kind of saying without realizing it is that I am not this one, I'm not this one, I'm not this one or this one or this one. And so there's this, half of who you are, or at least half of these traits go unexplored. And so we're kind of like a lopsided basketball. And there's so much of ourselves that like would be, nice. It's like a wheel that needs to be, round. And it, maybe on this part of the wheel, it just is like not developed. And so every time life rolls around in a way that requires us to have that skill that we have by that time admitted we are not, which isn't true, it's clunk, 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 over and over. So shadow work helps us to question who we are. And so my approach to personality is not what are you, it's why do you think that you're not this? And so that way you can't weaponize these personality tests against yourself without realizing that's what you're doing. So I take people
Yeah.
through the big five of personality, these 10 traits, and I kind of just evaluate that person's relationship with each of these, parts. And I help them to understand like why they really like one and why they really don't like another. And a lot of the time, what I learn is that they had an experience with somebody who had kind of become synonymous with whatever that trait was. And then they, that person kind of poisoned the well for that trait. And then they're like, okay, well, I can't be that. So I'm actually a really good example of that, because growing up, my dad, loved my dad, but he was very militaristic. He was your typical boomer, there
Yeah.
was not a lot of understanding of, compassion and mental health. And it was just by the sweat of your brow, that's how you make life work. And so he's a workhorse.
Yeah.
And it's just like, repress, 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 just deal with it, grind, 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 and, so my dad he was, my what I learned masculinity from. And so much of the way that he was masculine in a way felt wrong or off. And so my brain kind of coupled masculinity with asshole. And so when that happened, I started this civil war within myself. Um, and it was something that, I didn't realize I was doing, but I thought, well, if I then behave in a masculine way, then I'm also an asshole. And so I kind of moved into a very, feminine, I kind of, I disowned that part of me. My masculinity went into the shadow. And it was a long time later, basically because of, the pain of trying to, date in a very conservative BYU Mormon culture as a very feminine dude is like, nah, that did not go well.
Yeah.
And that pain builds and builds. And you're like, why am I not accepted? Well, it's because I haven't accepted all the parts that are me, and I'm lopsided. I'm a dude who can only be feminine, you know? And that was like,
Yeah.
and I had to reclaim that. I had to reintegrate the things that were in my shadow back into who I am as a person. And I basically had to make peace with masculinity and realize that all that happened there was that I had misattributed what masculinity was. I had misdefined it based off of somebody else and their
Yeah.
behavior. And so that's what I do is I mean, any deconstruction oriented question or challenge is what I've made my wheelhouse. But I found that a lot of that, like a lot of the people are focusing on problems that are in the branches and not getting at the root of it, you know,
Hmm.
because it's like if, for example, if somebody had taught me at that time, oh, like you just need to be more masculine and, it didn't feel right, but I just pushed through and did it anyway, that wouldn't have solved the problem that was like deeper in my psyche, that was like causing all of this to come up. So,
Yeah.
I was just, playing with the symptoms instead of getting to the root cause of what was causing my relationships to be off and my relationship with myself to be off. And just, uh, yeah. And so for each of these traits, there's so much in these 10 traits. I mean, that's, personality, that's what we are. And then by exploring that, I was able to kind of help myself and then subsequently help others to see where their blind spots are, where where people's pain are, because that pain, like if somebody is like, oh, I really don't like that trait. I'm like, why? And they can't tell me. I'm like, ooh, subconsciously, we've got something in there. And so shadow work is kind of like, in the 90s, how everything had a cord. And then as things suddenly became cordless, every house in America had like a box or a basket just full of cords that got tangled. But doing
Yep.
shadow work is kind of like putting your hand into that bag and, pulling something out and be like, hey, what's the story with this? Why is this here? Why is it
Yeah.
that like I hate this thing so much? And you think about people who are raised in extremely conservative Christian cultures. What's something you're guaranteed to find there? Your sexuality. And not just
Right.
and not necessarily that you're going to switch your orientation, although you very may well do that. Like just that was just something that was never acceptable to explore. And so people just have, very vanilla, very just like check the box sexual relationships, and that causes a lot of problems. And so yeah, so shadow work. I also integrate human needs psychology, which basically is really it's kind of a companion. It's another lens, I guess you could say, to look at yourself and look at people through. That also pairs really well with the personality psychology. So all that has to do with identity, and those three together are like the most powerful way that I've ever seen to explore who someone is, which obviously is something that a lot of people who are deconstructing, that's like at the heart of all of their struggle, is not having a sense of identity. And people are really cautious after leaving high demand religion because they don't want to, fall on that sword twice, where they leave one dogmatic approach to life, one prescription, and then just replace it with another. And
Yeah.
so one of the things I recommend people do is kind of what we were talking about before, where you don't hop onto something new. You just pick and choose. You get to explore things. You give yourself all the permission in the world to try things that that you might very well be like, well, that was a shit show. That was awful. That's okay. Like we're just getting data points on who we are, who we could be, and challenging the preconceived notions about who we are, because all that came, from from the external stuff of what we had to do in order to get love, to be validated. And so that was a big part of how we formed our self-image, and a lot of that is fraudulent. It's not really us. It was a coping mechanism that we had to, I guess, invent. We had to develop in order to survive. And
Yeah.
what we want to be doing after, living through high demand religion is not just surviving like we were before. We want to thrive. We want to really, be able to just soak in life, because it is so precious. Because without that, guaranteed that there's an afterlife, it's like, wow, I got to make this time count. And so helping people to
Yeah.
get there as quickly as possible just gives them more time to be who they really are, and to
Hmm.
just squeeze every drop of juice from the orange of life, so to speak.
Yeah, I think that's really valuable, and sounds like you've helped a lot of people to do that, and to really get through that deconstruction and that identity crisis, and
Yeah.
that's really great. Um, so you talked about kind of your upbringing, your faith transition, becoming a coach. Was there anything? I mean, you talked about not, really being into the real estate. Did you decide to become a life coach after that? You said you did work for a startup. I'm just
Yeah.
curious about like how you decided to become a life coach.
Yeah. So 2015 was when I was in Sacramento, and by the end of that summer, I'd gone back to Utah. And I was just doing sales jobs that made me want to end my life every day for the next, like, man, probably till about 2016, 2017, probably. I was just doing sales jobs, and I worked, big global corporate America jobs, and then I jumped from that to a four-person startup. And that's actually where, at this startup company, my job was so mind numbing. If you watched me for 9 seconds, like I timed it, if you watched me do my job for 9 seconds, I just repeated that 8 hours a day. I was basically copy and pasting email addresses for the startup. I was creating the database that they were going to be selling to once their product was finally done. And so it was the most mind numbing thing in the world. But that actually ended up being one of the coolest things ever, but because I hardly needed a brain to do that job. And so I started listening to like motivational speakers and thought leaders and people who just like elevated life. Because obviously I was working all these sales jobs and just miserable because I hated what I was doing, which unfortunately
Yeah.
is, the life of a lot of people. And so I started listening to all these messages, and I was like, man, it would be so cool to like be one of these guys and, be a life coach, be a therapist, be something in mental health where it's just so fulfilling. And who knows, like without that monotonous job, I don't know if I would have ever, had the time to sit down and for like 8 hours a day be listening nonstop to podcasts and just learning and like growing so much as a person. So, it's kind of one of the things I try to help people realize with deconstruction is that like the worst day of your life was actually the best day of your life. Like that phase when I was at this job, my 9 second,
Yep.
repeat job, that was, the worst thing ever. That was one of the best things that ever happened to me because it caused so much pain. Like my life had caused so much pain that like I had a necessity. Like growing at this point was not optional because I was just so miserable, so unhappy in my life. So just like, ship without a rudder. So it's
Yeah, it's the classic build make lemonade out of the lemons, right?
yeah, yep, bingo.
Yeah. That's cool. Yeah, thanks for sharing that part of your story.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, and you talked about your specialty, I think. Is there anything else you wanted to talk about where, who you feel like would really benefit from working with you?
I find that the problem I spend most time with people, like when I'm on so I give people a free conversation uh,
Okay.
the first time just so they can get to know me, and because it's not to say that because someone's deconstructing that like I would be the best person for them. And so I don't
Right.
want to have people feeling they have to pay to show up to a disappointing, call where they risk, maybe I meet this guy and he totally sucks, you never know. And so I just give people like a free 30-minute conversation where we just chat. Like there's no agenda, there's no charge for it. It's just kind of like people are, there's a lot of anxiety about getting a therapist or a coach because it's like, who are they? Are they going to understand me? Is this going to take 10 years? Are we going to mesh? Is it going to be like an awkward relationship? And so I just give them that. So like, at least you'll know quickly and for free without having like a financial, risk there. But anyway, getting back to what, like the problem I help most people solve, a lot of it is just their relationships with family members and friends who are still in. Like that's the biggest pain. I think that if we, if families all left at the same time, a lot of the deconstruction would be done. But it's very hard to, keep because when you learn what the church has done and what it still does, and how toxic and like outwardly offensive, like they go after groups of people who just want to be left alone and like, try to pass legislation that limits their freedom and doesn't give them, just the basic human rights that they get to think about every single day without even having to question, what rights they have.
Yeah.
It can be really hard to maintain relationships with people who are still supporting that. And it's so heartbreaking because when we leave the church and we look at how much money we have donated to the church, donated, it was coerced out of us, under the threat of never being able to be with our families again, which there's no
Right.
consent there. It's a big struggle, and so it's painful. It's like you realize that something is a scam, and then you get out of it, but then your family, and friends refuse, and they keep on paying all this money that gets turned into legislation that hurts people. It's just like, why? Why are you doing that? And that's kind of one of the lines in the sand that I draw, where it's like, if we're really trying to be good people and you are funding any organization that uses that money to hurt people, really, really hard to convince me that you're a phenomenal human being. And, that's
Yeah.
hard because the people who are still in are also victims of it. Their shelf is
Right.
still accumulating, but, people are still just really abusing that magic wand of faith, So that's the problem, because even the people who are perpetuating the harm are also victims of the harm, and they don't see that. And because their
Yeah.
entire lives have been so invested in this being true, that it's like one of the questions I ask people to gauge whether or not I should engage with them at all, in a discussion about the Mormonism or Christianity, is this: if your religion wasn't true, would you even want to know? And I almost always get no, which is mind-boggling to me, because I thought, like, when I left, I I wanted to know. And so that's me projecting on everybody else. They would also want to know. But I think people are so afraid to lose that it's like, if they lose that, what do they then have to deal with? An insurmountable amount of pain.
Yeah.
And that is so hard for people to do, especially given that we are wired to run from pain. Like, that is the survival mechanism of our brain, is that, well, if it's painful, if you incur enough pain, that means damage. And if you take enough damage, that means death. And so our brain is wired to streamline that. So pain equals death. And that's why we have such an aversion to looking at these things. Well, you see people who, they make a claim and then somebody says, oh, here, I can prove that's not true. And then they show it to them and they're like, nope. And they just double down.
Yeah.
It's like, it's not because they're dumb. It's because they're
Right.
afraid of pain.
Yeah.
And so that's what it is.
I
Like
like that way.
yeah, my job is to help people move closer to pain.
Yeah.
And, that's
Eh,
why it can be hard, because it's like, I don't want to bullshit people about what I do or what, what deconstruction is, because it's like you can't love someone without trust. You can't deconstruct without pain.
Yeah.
It's like, you have to realize that on some level, this is surgery, and it's going to
Yeah.
hurt. And it's going to hurt, like, to just a pretty wild degree,
Yeah.
but you need the surgery. And it's not
Yep.
just for your own sake that people need the surgery, but so they don't keep on perpetuating this system. Like, a lot of people who realize the damage it's done and then don't leave because it's too painful, not only have to reckon with the fact that they're staying in, as a way to avoid pain, but also that new people are being sucked into this system that cannibalizes them. You know,
Yeah.
and that's the real thing, because a lot of people will say, well, if it makes you happy, no. If it makes you happy at the expense of somebody else's happy, no. And in one of my TikToks, I brought up this analogy, like, let's say there's this button you could push, and when you push it, it fills you with positive emotion. You feel amazing. And so you obviously come back to it, because all I got to do is push this button. All I got to do is just show up to church, and I'm in the one and only true religion. It's awesome. I feel good. I'm a child of God. All these, ego stroking things are, sent at you to make you feel that you're amazing. It feels good. Of course it does. That's why we go back despite all the pain. But what if you realize that when that button gets pushed across the street, there's a robotic arm and it pops out and punches someone in the face? Is it ethical to still push that button? No, it is not. And so this whole, well, if
Right.
it makes you happy, that only works if the thing making you happy is not funded by somebody else's suffering, by somebody else's pain. That's where I go, no. Like that's where and people think I'm very extreme, for that. And of course we're all guilty of it, at some point. We're all buying products, and who knows, like maybe like a baby seal got clubbed because you bought those boots, you didn't realize at the time. Like we're all causing, we're all consuming, right?
Yeah.
And like, how much plastic am I responsible for, being produced in the world? It's like, yeah, that's true, and that's kind of unavoidable. I mean, well, obviously we're working toward that. Um, but whatever the system is, I think that it's fairly, I mean, is it a challenging moral conclusion to come to just think, man, if we could do better, we should. Like, but people are so afraid to leave this system because of the pain there, that they're even willing to subject other people to it. And it's kind of
Yeah.
like that quote that we see from time to time on social media, where it's like it's talking about, like, parents who hit their kids versus gentle parenting. And it's like parents who use the argument of, like, well, I got my ass beat as a child, so like they're going to be fine too. It's like, you, sir, did not turn out fine as you claim. You did not.
Yeah.
And so it's realizing that, like, there is something like this is the decision to stay in or leave is very much an ethical decision. And when your reason to stay in is, well, I'll feel pain. Sure, it causes that guy pain. It's so selfish. It's so missing the point of all the good things that Jesus taught. There's the Bible Jesus, which, like, yikes, and then there's the vision of Jesus, like the shape-shifty Jesus that people keep in their brains, a more palatable Jesus that they can worship, the one that didn't command
Yeah.
genocide and ethnic cleansing and slavery and rape and murdering
Yep.
children and, murdering anybody for trivial offenses like eating shrimp. It's just,
Right.
the Bible has no case for being our ethical standard whatsoever.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things where it's like we have to deconstruct not only from the heart, but also the head.
Yeah.
Because when we do that, like, I found that a lot of people that I've coached who, like, for example, I coach atheists who say that they are, atheist. Well, if you're atheist, you don't believe in heaven, you don't believe in hell. And yet some of these atheists will say, I have this wild fear in the back of my brain that's always there, that I'm wrong and I'm going to burn in hell, right? Just because you consciously might say, oh, I don't believe that anymore. Your subconscious mind is still saying, oh, yes, you do. You've been absorbing this, for decades. You think you can just all of a sudden step away from it? Which
Yeah.
leads us to another fun thing I talk about with my clients, which is that you don't choose your beliefs. It is not a conscious choice that you make. If belief was just a choice, just choose to believe, as the Christians and the Mormons say, then why couldn't somebody just choose to believe in Santa Claus again? Like, disregard that you know
Yeah.
how it works now. Just choose to believe. You literally cannot get yourself to do it. And if you could, it would happen at the expense of your mental health by breaking your brain, like torturing yourself to get to that point. And of what utility would that conclusion be? And then that brings us to
Right.
another question. Well, like, if we don't choose our beliefs, what's the relationship between our beliefs and our behaviors? Very tied. If we don't have control over our beliefs, then to what degree is free will free? To what degree is it actually real? And if it's not as solid and as certain as, we just choose, what we do and what we believe, then what argument is there to say that somebody could rightfully judge us? Like the mechanism, belief is the thing that determines our behavior. And if we don't have control over this, it's, like, then what do we say about this? What do we say about, judgment? Like it brings, to have free will questioned, it's like, whoa. One of the things about deconstruction is that the rabbit hole never ends. The implications of your religion not being true are so vast, which is why people are afraid to deconstruct, which is why we will go through absolutely insane, unethical, and illogical attempts. We'll take those measures in order to keep our faith true in our brain.
Yeah.
And it's like it doesn't. The deeper you go, the less likely you are of staying in, which is why a lot of people love that the church says, just don't ever read any of it. Just cling to the rod of God, just, if you just endure to the end, the celestial kingdom awaits you. And it's just 1984 religion edition. That's all it is. But it's like
Benson, Book of Mormon, just read it every day. It takes all your time from reading anything else. And that's all you think about. That's all you know.
Yeah, so it's, on one hand, it's like you understand and can be so compassionate towards somebody who is caught up in this, before the deconstruction is taking place, because it's like I'm telling somebody like, hey, come meet with me. We'll ruin your life. But then we'll make it so much better. But like, obviously the brain holds a lot more weight on the, the pain that you're going to, experience, the uncomfortable truths. And that can be so, we're naturally wired to be so adverse to that it's just like, nope. And we won't focus on like that, but it'll get so much better. So
yeah,
that's kind of the way that I've seen it go with people. But one of the coolest things that a client has ever told me, and this guy was, he was about to go buy a mic and to become an LDS apologist on TikTok and, fight people like me. And he just wanted to talk to me, not as like a client, but by the end of the conversation, and I'll never forget that he said this, is he just said, I think I just need someone to tell me it's okay that I don't actually believe it anymore. Like he had already realized that his subconscious had already put it together and was trying to break through into his conscious mind, but he magic wand of faith did every time, or just like, nope, distraction, or whatever. We don't do that. That's the devil. That's anti-Mormon literature. And just ran and ran and ran, and man, that's exhausting. And because I'm not trying to like debate people or hurt, like me on TikTok, me on social media where I talk about my beliefs and stuff like this. That's debate. But when I'm on with a client, like that's the version of me that people never see on TikTok or Instagram, because I'm not trying to persuade you to believe the things that I believe. It's like I'm trying to just help you shake the chains, just to ask questions, And I have clients who, believe in energy work and, things that I consider a little bit woo, a little woo woo. No problem, as long as it's, not hurting people. And obviously there's a line to be drawn there, and, what gets prioritized on that list of things that we need to stop doing. But yeah, I'm not trying to turn people into me. I'm trying to get people to ask questions and to explore who they could be. So it's more about authenticity than it is, because otherwise I would just be exchanging one dogma for another. They lose the churches, but they get mine. It's like, why? Seems, why limit yourselves to just me? It's like there's so many things that I'm just not naturally into, or just haven't had time to explore. And if you limit your identity, your development, your coach or your therapist, that's silly. Almost defeats the point of having that person. So I'm like, while I do ask questions that definitely destabilize what people, believe, it's done in a very, gentle, like, hey, like we're just trying different shoes on. We're trying different hats on. We're just embracing that we don't know what the hell we're doing. And there is no ultimate authority, no man in the sky who can say that you can't wear a tank top. So maybe wear the tank top. Just see what it's like, It's like I'd always been taught, no beard and, short, hair. And like, this was me just saying like, I don't know if it's gonna look good. Like Kyle with long hair, never met that guy, and I was like, why not? And so like 2 years ago, I just shaved my head with a razor because I was like, like never been bald guy before. And then now it's
Uh-huh.
turned into this. It's just like just silly things. Just let everything go. Just completely reconstruct yourself. And instead of being so worried about what if it's not me? What if I don't like it? Wonderful. Well, then Then you can move on to more stuff. It's like how people talk about like the fear stops people from being successful more than failure ever will. Because people don't ever
Yeah.
try. They don't ever start. They don't ever just be like, I'm gonna be a long hair Kyle. You know, does this look better or worse than before? No idea. Had a few girls tell me I should cut it. So there's some data points. But it's like I'm just I'm just vibing with a different Kyle, you know? I'm just trying different things, letting myself fuck it up, knowing I can switch back tomorrow if I want to, because the old me will always be there. Like, you know,
Yeah.
yeah, we live in these ruts for so long that it's hard to not fall into them. It's like the old versions of ourselves are like chasing us, like it's hard to get away from them because the old version of ourselves or the present version of ourselves, we know how to operate in the system of how to get love as we currently are. But if we switched up the variables that comprise who we are, then we have to wonder, am I going to still be able to meet my needs? Or am I going to end
Yep.
up, friendless and alone, and the weirdo, whatever. It's just,
Yeah.
we're conditioned to conform. And when people choose to be brave, which only happens if you are afraid. It's like a lot of people want to be brave, but they never want to be uncomfortable. And it's like those do not mesh. It's like you have to give yourself permission to fuck it up because you're gonna.
Yep.
Either way, if you stay in, if you stay out, you're gonna fuck it up one way or another, because that's just being human. So why not at least, consider that these fuck ups will possibly lead to something more beautiful than whatever your life is right now. It's just opening it up and seeing what happens, just rolling the dice, because it's like for all the evidence, it suggests quite strongly there is no sequel after this. That we don't have,
Yeah.
that consciousness doesn't go into a next life. And people will bring up near death experiences. So you see, like these people, they know things. I'm like, well, what I see is like, a Buddhist person who had a near death experience sees Buddha. The Christian sees Christ. The Islamic person sees Muhammad or Allah. It's like, which is more likely that all these things are actually happening, that all these gods exist, that all these different doctrines and religious belief systems are true, or that the mind is capable of creating what you need in order to feel certain, to gain that level of control that you need in order to function? And the answer is obviously the latter.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a Netflix documentary, How to Change Your Mind.
Yes, psychedelics.
And
Ooh,
yeah, and the Catholic, I don't remember her name, but I can't remember. I think she was doing psilocybin. I could be wrong. And
uh-huh.
her experience was seeing the Mother Mary.
Yeah,
So, right. It's so just like you were saying, it's kind of how we've been conditioned to believe or to think. Those are kind of those spiritual or unexplainable
yeah,
things.
mystical
You can kind of
experiences.
tie them back. Yeah, you can tie them back to basically how you were raised or what you know.
Yeah.
So, yeah, so that's a good point. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on. I want to give you a chance to, before we wrap it up, share anything else that you feel like you want to tell people. Is there anything else that you have on your mind or anything that you left out?
Ooh, so many things on my mind all the time.
Well,
I,
you're
I,
welcome to come back too, on the podcast and share, whatever you want. So,
sure, I'd do another episode sometime. But to answer your question, I think that people underestimate the value of one conversation with a therapist, with a coach, and that person doesn't have to be me by any stretch of the imagination. But I've seen so many people who just booked a call with me, and within even like a half hour, we've been able to get like help people get their direction, like get their feet back from under them, and kind of just dust them off after getting knocked down and just be able to move forward. And one tiny conversation with somebody who understands the dilemma that you're in can be absolutely invaluable. So if you are finding that life is tough, that deconstruction is kind of an ass kicker right now, ask for some help. Everybody needs help. It's like therapists have therapists, coaches have coaches. I do. And so it's like so much healing is so accessible, so available to people, but you just, have to reach out to somebody and just start conversations. Because I measure healing in terms of conversations. Like that's one of the things that gets me up in the morning. It's like, it's the conversation. Like what cool conversation, is waiting for me to engage in today that is going to teach me something, or that's going to help me, or that's going to, crumble something that I currently believe that isn't true, that could be replaced by something that's more beautiful, more true. So it's just walk into the jungle. It's dangerous, but so is not going into the jungle.
Right.
So
That's such a cool insight. Yeah, I love that. And I've definitely seen that with, my wife deconstructed with me, and which has been amazing because we've had conversations, for the past, really it was basically the last 3 years. And that's one of the things that has come up when we've been talking, is how we can't have these conversations. We can't go into the jungle with people who are still
yeah,
subscribed to the church.
yeah,
The conversations
yeah,
are just kind of a little, they just don't blossom like it does when you can just open your mind and be curious.
yeah. I did just, I'm just remembering, if people are having a problem with being able to talk to believing family members or friends, it was, on the Almost Awakened podcast, I think with Bill Reel and Britt Hartley, I talked about, there's like a 4-step approach for how to optimize the possibility that conversation will go well, and how to approach that in a way that doesn't just immediately, trigger the defense mechanisms that kind of cause those conversations to backfire. So if people are in that kind of a situation where talking with believing family and friends is a challenge, you might want to look at that video. Or you
Yeah.
get a free session with me. So go ahead and book one. Shameless plug for my services, beyondgodandreligion.com. You just click the book a free session button and fill out some information, and I'll contact you. So
Yeah. And is that your handles, right? On social media, TikTok? Is
yep,
it all, are they okay?
Beyond God
Eh,
and Religion. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And yeah, so I'll put all those links, of course, and people can follow you
Awesome,
and book
thank
a
you.
call with you. And yeah. Um, so I don't know if you want to, you kind of shared something that was really helpful, but if, the kind of the thing that I want to try to do at the end of each episode is a mindful moment. So it's like 60 seconds, your one big takeaway that you want someone going through a faith transition to know. And you kind of shared some things that could probably fall into that,
Sure.
several things. But is there anything else like you want to give, like your going away mindful moment?
Let's see. Even when the truth hurts, it's best to embrace it. That's a tough
That's
one.
good.
That's a really tough one. But I saw this quote that said, "You have nothing to fear by knowing the truth." And I kind of questioned that. I was like, actually, the truth has a lot of pain to it. But I still agreed with, the point of the quote, which was walk into the jungle.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah,
okay
that
if you're wrong
concept.
about something. It's so much better to know that you are, because then you can start asking better questions. Like, if I'm wrong about this, then what's a better idea? And then your life just goes up and up, because the quality of ideas, the quality of behavior, just goes up when you question things. So be brave.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Well, thanks, Kyle. I think that's a wrap.
Well, thanks for the conversation. It's been good getting to know you.
Yeah, likewise.
I always need
Thanks a
more
lot,
pals in
and
my life.
right? Good times.
All
Okay.
right, man.
Thanks, Kyle.
Yep. See ya.
Have a good night.